It is rivalry weekend for the next, let's say, 2 weekends, depending on your team and your conference. We talk USC and UCLA with Tony Siracusa. You can join him on Last Word on College Football. Tony, how you doing this fine day?
Hey, Mark, good to be with you.
USC and UCLA. I don't know that there's a prettier setting if you're watching on television, and I'm sure it's 1,000 times better when you're at the game. And I know that they're at the Coliseum this particular season, but I'm thinking more at the Rose Bowl with the way they dress up the field and with the uniforms of UCLA contrasting with USC. I think it's one of the great spectacles if you just want a beautiful scene of college football when they play at the Rose Bowl. This year at the Coliseum, USC, UCLA with those beautiful traditional uniforms on. It's quite a setting.
Well, you know, it's funny that you mentioned the uniforms because there's a gentleman's agreement that has been going on for quite a few years now. And that was set up with Rick Neuheisel when he was the head coach at UCLA. Pete Carroll was at SC. Neuheisel wanted to go back to the tradition of both teams wearing their home uniforms. For those who don't know, both teams actually used to play at the Coliseum up until 1983. They split their home games, and on the USC-UCLA game, they would split the stadium. But both teams would wear their home uniforms. Neuheisel wanted to go back to that, but by NCAA rules, that would cost him a timeout. So Pete Carroll agreed to burn a timeout early on in the game on his end, so both teams would just have 2 timeouts for the half, but they would have the spectacle, as you called it, of both being in their brilliant home uniforms that are so attention-getting.
No question about that. It's a beautiful sight, and I think they have 2 of the legendary uniforms in college football, and when you put them on the same field, it just brings back memories as well for both of us. So we talked, Tony and I, about that prior to hitting the record button. Ohio State, Michigan at noon, USC, UCLA at 4 o'clock, and when I say noon and 4 o'clock, I'm speaking East Coast time. Back in the day, for me, as a little tyke, that's what I grew up in. Typically, especially if you run the thread through the 70s and early 80s, you're talking about that matchup typically in both conferences, meaning a Rose Bowl berth. And so you were all set up for a championship scenario with the outcomes of those 2 games in the Big Ten and the Pac-8, then the Pac-10, then the Pac-12. All right, Tony, I got to ask you this, too, because this bothers me as well. And I know I got an explanation from yourself or somebody down the line, Don King, one of you guys at some point, because it bothered me regarding the USC-UCLA rivalry, and also it affected Stanford and Cal. So I was always accustomed to USC-UCLA wrapping up the season. Same thing with Stanford and Cal. And then it snuck up on me. I didn't hear any kind of change or agreement or adjustment in the Pac-12 schedule, but I'm guessing 3 to 5 years ago, all of a sudden I'm noticing UCLA's playing Stanford to conclude the season. Cal's playing somebody else. USC's wrapping up with Notre Dame possibly at that particular time. And it just kind of shook my world because I grew up with, again, as you did, certain games being played as the last game of the season, meaning these are the fiercest of rivals. They should be playing the final game.
Well, as you pointed out, back in the 70s and the 80s, that USC-UCLA game, the Ohio State-Michigan game, were traditionally on the 3rd Saturday of November. And those 2 games generally decided who was going to the Rose Bowl game. Sometimes Washington would get in there, but really in the Pac-8 and then Pac-10, it was those 3 teams for essentially a generation. What happened is, as a lot of the other conferences started going to conference championship games that would sneak in to that first Saturday in November, the Pac-8, Pac-10 was sitting there with no activity, nothing going on. And to the minds of the athletic directors, the school presidents and chancellors, it was hurting them in the eyes of the voters, whether it be the poll voters, the BCS voters later on. So what they did was they started to stretch the schedule into Thanksgiving weekend. And then once they got into 12 teams, adding Utah and Colorado a few years ago, then they had their own championship game and they were on even footing with everybody else. So yes, it did tinker with the schedule. There have been a few years where the USC-UCLA game was on Thanksgiving weekend. They have tried to keep it that 3rd Saturday of November. But as you point out, what happens then is you wind up ending the season at home against Cal next week, like UCLA is, in, pretty anticlimactic fashion. I mean, you got to figure the USC-UCLA rivalry. I know you and I grew up looking at Ohio State, Michigan, Auburn, Alabama, and the Iron Bowl, even Oklahoma, Nebraska way back when. This rivalry, though, is truly unlike any other. The two schools, for those who don't know the geography, you think of LA County, Orange County being huge. These two schools are only 13 miles apart from each other. They spend 365 days a year recruiting the same high schools, recruiting the same players, going at each other, across LA and Orange County. That huge expanse of geography, and these two schools are just right here, right in each other's neighborhood, 13 miles apart from each other. It really is unlike anything else.
And Tony, what is, in a nutshell, kind of describe the general environment, classification of each school, and how they differ, and from an atmosphere standpoint, from an enrollment standpoint, in the aspects outside of football?
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. USC is a world-renowned private university. It runs about $51,000, $52,000 per year to go to school at USC. The campus, however, is in one of the most financially depressed areas of South Central LA. It's right next to the LA Coliseum, but it is in what historically is a pretty dicey part of town. The strange view you have is those kids who can afford the $52,000 a year, or their families can afford the $52,000 a year tuition, and the kid got a BMW for his high school graduation, driving through that part of town onto campus. UCLA is in West LA. It's a state school. It's University of California, Los Angeles, so it's funded by the taxpayers of the state of California. It's a public school. It runs 12 to 13,000 a year, but it's in the midst of Bel Air and Brentwood, literally nestled, right? I mean, you can actually walk from the dorms on the UCLA campus. It's a 10-minute walk into Bel Air. And so, but because of the type of school it is, you see everybody with their hand-me-down, Volkswagen Jettas driving onto campus, going through Bel Air and Brentwood. So they really are dramatically different in style, in campus atmosphere. USC got about a 39, 40-year head start on UCLA in terms of its existence and its athletic program. And it pretty much dominated the crosstown rivalry for a couple of decades, as a result as well. UCLA wasn't anywhere near up to speed. They went back and forth through the 60s, the 70s, and 80s. The 60s was, of course, the O.J. Simpson and Mike Garrett days. Gary Beeben, if you're a UCLA fan, the Bruins Heisman Trophy winner. Matter of fact, this week is the 50th anniversary of what most consider one of the greatest college football games ever. It was number 1 UCLA against number 4 USC. O.J. Simpson had a run that is still on most people's highlight reels, a 64-yard run to win the game 21-20. Beeben's consolation prize was the Heisman Trophy, remains UCLA's only Heisman winner. The atmosphere divides families. It divides kids, like we talked about the recruiting of high school kids. People who were teammates all through high school now become bitter rivals. Or people who were high school rivals now become teammates for life as they see it, because, they're now both Bruins or they're both Trojans. One of the classic stories was a UCLA running back from the 70s, Wendell Tyler. He was one of the captains of the 1976 Rose Bowl championship team when they beat Ohio State and Archie Griffin in that game. But Wendell was a Bruin, always a Bruin. And then in the early 2000s, his son, Mark, went to USC. And Wendell was castigated by the UCLA faithful. He openly admitted he got hate mail from people because he allowed his son to become a Trojan. That is the mentality that goes on in this town between the two schools. It's played out on the field. You don't see violence or anything like that, but it truly is a bitter rivalry because you have to live with each other at work or in your neighborhood or whatever the case may be. the entire year after the game.
Wendell Tyler, who later starred with the Los Angeles Rams, played a Super Bowl against the Pittsburgh Steelers there at the Rose Bowl in 1980. And on the sideline for that UCLA team that ironically lost to Ohio State. This rarely happened in the regular season. There was a regular season matchup that Ohio State won fairly handily, and they were a huge favorite in that game against UCLA, but the Bruins came back to win in decisive fashion in the second half. Dick Vermeil, that most people would identify most closely with the NFL as the Philadelphia Eagles and St. Louis Rams head coach, and later as a commentator, was a legendary coach there at UCLA.
That Rose Bowl was his last game as the head coach at UCLA. He went on to the Eagles, as you say, afterwards, and then was replaced by Terry Donahue. Here's an idea of how important this game is. USC changed coaches that year also. John McKay moved on to coach a new franchise in the NFL, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And Vermeil went to the Eagles. USC got Oakland Raiders assistant John Robinson, and UCLA promoted from within with Terry Donahue. Donahue lost his first 4 games in the rivalry. He openly admits to this day he knew very well if he'd lost number 5, he was going to be fired. That would have been 1980. That game would have been the 5th consecutive loss. UCLA won 20-17. Vermeil went on, Donahue rather, went on to coach until 1983, 2000. Sorry, let me get my years right. He went on to coach all the way to 1993. So he had a very long career, became the winningest coach in conference history, winningest coach in UCLA history, but he almost didn't make it to that 5th year at all. It's you lose to USC consecutive years, you get beat like that. There's a price to pay.
And Donahue had quite a string of Rose Bowl triumphs over the Big Ten, mostly as an underdog. Beat Michigan following the '82 season, an Iowa team that was ranked in the top 5 in the country. Illinois a few years later was mixed in there as well, 1983 actually, and then Iowa the following season against Chuck Long, who was a Heisman finalist that lost to Bo Jackson.